But you got motherfucking amnesia now, huh? Look, bitch, you know goddamn well what my fucking name is. Let me ask you a question. What kind of dope you smoking, baby? What kind of game are you?
Something wrong? Kay?
Hi, my name is Dom Griffin. I'm a film critic, and you're watching the Armchair Auteur. It's an ongoing video series I do where I review movies, talk about old films, deconstruct screenplays, that sort of thing. If you're into film culture and you like seeing people analyze movies from different angles, please consider subscribing. Today is going to be the second episode of the Dark Gable Presents series. It's a series in the channel where I revisit an old column I used to run at deadshirt.net where I highlight old black movies, not always old, sometimes new ones, just films that I feel like are underrated or celebrate the black experience through different lenses than what we typically see in mainstream media. So pretty much anything that is not a Tyler Perry movie or a serious black torture porn movie, all the stuff in between that I think people tend to overlook a lot or don't take quite as seriously. Today we're going to be looking at the film Death by Temptation from 1990, which is a horror comedy written and directed by James Bond III, who also stars in the film. It's sort of a vampire succubus piece, and I think it's really, really underrated. So a little bit of background, I first saw Death by Temptation when I was roughly 4 to 5 years old. I was visiting some cousins in Brooklyn, and I think my mom and her family were watching it, and I just watched it way too young. As with many movies, if you follow me on the channel, I watched a lot of bad stuff when I was a kid, I suppose. But what's weird to me about Death by Temptation is I haven't watched this movie in like 30 years, and yet I remember so much of the movie, like lines of dialogue, specific shots, like so much of the imagery of this film and how it captures New York with this sort of like off-kilter late 80s, early 90s like vibe has seeped into my brain and is like burned, seared onto like my brain lines about how I view New York City as a whole. Even though I've been in the city tons of times before and since, and even though I've seen tons of movies set in New York that are like bigger, better movies, this one like really kind of sticks with me. So Death by Temptation is largely about two different friends. Joel, who is a young pastor sort of at a crossroads with his faith, who's played by the writer-director James Bond III, who used to be a child actor in the 70s. And his best friend, Kay, played by Kadeem Hardison, who you guys all know from like A Different World and other movies, who is now a semi-successful actor living in the city. So the movie's about their friendship, and Joel, who's sort of like the son of a preacher, played by Sam Jackson in some of the flashbacks, is at a crossroads between like his faith and who he wants to be and what he wants to do with his life, and he sort of wants to escape his like bumpkin town and live a little bit, so he comes to visit Kay in New York City. And through this visit, through these travels and seeing the city in like a very different life than he's used to, he's tempted by the title by this vampirous succubus figure played by Cynthia Bond, who is some sort of otherworldly demon type who uses lust to control men. And she's very, very drawn to Joel because he seems like a pure-hearted individual. So like that's like the crux of the movie, is about him coming to New York to visit his friend, and then while he's there, like this lady wants to eat his soul. Now, upon revisiting the movie, what sticks with me so much, what's so striking about it, is how well it balances like 4 different shifting tones. A lot of movies that try to be many things at once tend to fail at all of them. It's like very difficult to blend different genres or tones or feelings without the movie feeling like it's just cobbled together from different stuff. Death by Temptation, at its core, is like a buddy movie. The stuff between Joel and Kay is really touching. It's like a really interesting little indie movie about friendship. Their rapport, their like banter and stuff, it's very believable, it's very affecting. They're two people that are very easy to watch and be engaged in, and like you want to see more about their relationship and you want to understand like the lost years between them from living apart and what it's like visiting together and stuff like that. Like it's really engaging. At the same time, it's also sort of like a love triangle vibe because Kay actually meets the succubus character before Joel comes to town. Like he's actually really taken with her, but she is no longer interested with him once Joel shows up because Joel is like a much bigger bounty for her evil aims. So you've got those two sort of warring things, and there's also like a genuine, actual good horror vibe going on here. Like, this is a movie that it doesn't just like dip its toe in the genre it's working within. It's actually a really affecting horror movie. Like on some level, it sort of reminds me a little bit of like Ganja and Hess in the sense that has this sort of like somewhat dated, artsy approach to horror, but it still actually really works and it's still really, really, really visually striking. I think that the biggest thing that's shocking to me about the movie is how actually unsettling it is at times. The visuals are unique and they really do give you this mood of a New York City that is rife with temptation, as it is for Joel's character, in a very real, actual way, with the supernatural stuff layered on top as like an outsized metaphor for what he's really going through. Which is made all the more fascinating by just how low budget this movie was working with. It looks and feels more thought out and more put together than most movies in that segment at that time. Also, the movie's billed as a horror comedy, most likely because it's like an early trauma film, but it actually generally does work as a comedy when it wants to. Like, everything Bill Nunn says and does in this movie is like genuinely really funny. It's like one of his funniest turns. The idea that the movie wants you to believe that Kadeem Hardison's character is a successful actor, but the movies he's starring in are like Steven Seagal movies. Like, you want to believe that this is a world where Kadeem Hardison could have a bunch of straight to VHS action thrillers is like, that's amazing. The fact that Freddie Jackson shows up in this movie as himself in a cameo while his own song All Over You is playing in the background is like genuinely laugh out loud funny to me. But that stuff is just window dressing. At its core, this is actually a really well-functioning horror thriller. It's a movie that is about religious temptation. It is about the idea of moving outside of your comfort zone and being beguiled by things beyond your understanding. But it does it in a way that is like really pretty fucking disturbing, okay? Like, the way Cynthia Bond's character relishes how easily duped men in her orbit are by lust is genuinely like terrifying. Like, she it's like the movie sort of captures all of the different like anti-feminist tropes that exist within like buddy guy movies, where like the women are treated as sort of like these like other like villains, so to speak, but it like makes it literal. There's a really impressive sequence where she ensnares this married man and leaves him with like pustules and like all this different stuff, and he's terrified because he realizes he's gonna have to go home to his wife and she's gonna know what he's done, and she just is cackling about it. And like, this movie doesn't quite engage with sort of like the AIDS epidemic metaphor that is like in certain 80s vampire movies the way that, say, like Tony Scott's The Hunger does, but it's definitely there. It's definitely peppered throughout and makes it a little bit more like vital the way it's presented. But it's a movie that at one moment wants you to kind of like giggle along with the idea of like these characters being like ensnared by an evil she-beast, but then in the next scene she'll actually be fucking terrifying. Bond's performance is fantastic. Like, in one minute she's really beguiling and interesting and, you know, like lustful, and then the next she's like the scariest fucking monster I've seen. But the biggest reason I really wanted to highlight this movie is actually the cinematographer Ernest Dickerson. Ernest Dickerson, if you do not know him and are not familiar, was the cinematographer on a lot of Spike Lee's early films. He was also the cinematographer for most of the first season of Law & Order. And he went on to direct movies like Demon Knight and Bones and a lot of other films. Like, he's a pretty celebrated director. He mostly works in television now. He actually ended up meeting writer-director James Bond III from working with him on a Spike Lee movie. And the two of them had like a very unique collaborative process here, in the sense that James Bond III is like the star of the movie, and he wrote it and he directed it, but much of his direction was more focused on the characters and the actors and the performances, and he sort of like allowed Ernest Dickerson to do whatever the fuck he wanted with the visuals. So it's a movie that's, you know, cheap, you know, low budget, not a lot of locations, but Dickerson is such a beast with like moody lighting and camera work and just different compositions and stuff, and he gives the movie so much character. It's very similar to the type of visual schemes he would create in later movies, so it's like very, very, very clearly him and not Bond. And it's like insane. Like, the idea that these guys got together to work on this like low budget movie with a predominantly black cast, a predominantly black crew, that easily could have been like a throwaway movie, you know, like a la like certain types of like blaxploitation horror from the late 70s. And instead, they really clearly put a lot of their work into it to make it unique and different. So much of the script and the writing has a real affecting like homespun vibe. Like, you really buy into these characters as real people. You actually care about them. And so much of the visuals and the way that Dickerson presents the story is really impressive. It's a much better movie than you should have been able to get in 1990 for this amount of money. And I think part of that is because everyone involved, there's like this black community feel behind it of like they all wanted to make this movie really work. They really wanted to wring like the maximum amount of cinematic power from what is essentially kind of a throwaway horror premise. I mean, just Sam Jackson showing up as this like early turn, like before he became like a big name, really adds a lot of like gravitas to the movie, even though he's only in a couple of scenes. Parts of the film are actually shot in like Lawrence Fishburne's house, I think. Like, it's just all these guys coming together to try to make something really good and lasting out of, you know, what is usually sort of a disposable genre. It's genuinely insane to me that this movie is not more celebrated widely than it currently is. I think Death by Temptation is one of the most underrated vampire type movies out there. I think it holds up really well. That's not just like childhood nostalgia for me. It's actually something that I rewatched and was really, really taken with. It's exactly the kind of movie you don't typically see on a lot of these like listicles and like streaming platform suggestions for things to watch, you know what I mean? So like, if you can seek this movie out, if you can find it, definitely watch it. It's totally worth your time. It's not very long. It really packs a good punch, and it's fantastic. If you guys have seen the movie before, let me know what you think. If you haven't, please seek it out. It's definitely worth watching. I will have more horror-themed content coming up for the rest of the month because it's October. I mentioned it in the last video, but I have joined the podcast Late Fees on the RNC Watched podcasting network. Our newest episode is out, and I'll link it in the description below, but it is an episode about the Hatchet series, directed and written by Adam Green. We talk about Hatchet 1 through 3, and then we also talk about Hubie Halloween, the new Adam Sandler movie, because we have to. And really fun time. I love that podcast. I love being on it now, and I really want you guys to check it out too. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you have not subscribed, please consider subscribing. And if you are subscribed, hit the little bell icon so you get notifications when I drop new videos. We'll have another video out in the next few days. Like I said, more horror stuff, more spooky stuff, more scary shit. So like, get your Reese's Buttercups ready. We're doing the damn thing all month. Thanks.